Welcome Hemi Swappers. My name is Blake Anderman and this is the second installment of the Gen 3 Hemi Swap Basics tutorial. What we're going to cover today is the 2005 through 2008 car Hemi application. So if your donor vehicle happened to have been a 2005 through 2008 LX, like a Charger, something like that, this is really going to be your cup of tea. After that, we're going to follow up with a 2009 and on car application, really give you the overview, the basics of what you need to know, and then we'll slide on in to the wiring harness modifications and wrap things up for this tutorial session. So to get things started, let's again revert back to the 2005 to 2008 year models. In the car application, the PCM was actually placed to the rear passenger side of the vehicle, and it had a simple harness that ran along the sides of the engine, the fuel rails, and the injector packs. And then you have your strut bar, your crossbar right here. Well, you had one orange connector, one orange NGC PCM connector, and you had another auxiliary connector here. In the car applications, most didn't come with all of the three primary NGC connectors as we discussed in our previous video. So just to reiterate what we covered last time, you have four connectors on the NGC PCM. So we have the green, which is mostly it's your transmission controls. You have your neutral, which is think of that as your auxiliary controls and some engine controls. Orange is your primary engine controls, and black is your communication in and out of the vehicle. So your 12-volt power sources coming in, your PCM, your grounds, as well as like serial bus data connector links. These wires kind of go in that black section there. So with the cars, say 05 through 08-ish, you really just had the orange one on the harness. And the other connectors were left to the body side of the vehicle. If you had an NAG1 transmission, it actually had a blank spot here because it had its own separate transmission controller under the dash in the vehicle. So when you grab a harness from one of these cars, you'll immediately notice that it's missing some of the ECM connectors, and it's just the lay of the land, how it's done. So what we're going to do, I happen to have a spare harness here. I'll go ahead and kind of give you an idea of the way it'll look when it comes out of the vehicle. This is an old harness that's been tested on and modified up a bit, so it's not completely stock. What I can say is this end of the harness is all original. It has not been modified. So you have your coil pack connectors, your injector connectors, block grounds, starter connections, injectors, coils connections on this side as well, those sorts of things. Very standard on this side. As far as the engine side of the harness goes, what's actually physically on the engine itself, the car harness is much more aesthetically pleasing. It just looks nicer. You don't have a lot of bulkiness to it, especially say like the 05 or the later ones without the crossover. I want to say that's like 06 and on. They don't have the spaghetti on top of the intake manifold, right? They just look better. It's nicer for a custom application to kind of start with this and not really have to deal with the mess. It does get more complicated on this end, not having the original connector. So what you could see here is this harness had the orange connector. So you really think of orange, Hemi orange, right? Think of that as the engine controls. It's the injectors, the coils, and majority of what actually controls your engine. So Hemi orange, that's your heart of your engine. Really think of that when you see that color. These other connectors you see on here were actually grafted in. So the connector that was here, which is very similar to the C130 in the truck harness, was cut off, and the wires were brought in to a similar location as the orange connector. So as Chrysler calls it, neutral, it's the white connector, and the black connector were grafted in. This particular application didn't have a truck auto transmission like a 545 RFE. This is an old school 4-speed pistol grip A833 trans for this application, so no green connector, as you can see. Using the wiring schematics on the website, all we did was cut the connector here, the C130 if you're thinking of it from a truck perspective, reroute the wires as they go to on the diagram to the proper pins on the neutral and the black connector, and then reroute your pins from the black connector over to an OBD2 data link or diagnostic port with 12-volt power source, serial communication, and ground. What you can see remaining in this harness is we don't have the fuse box. That's what's remaining, that's what's left to be done. The PDM or power distribution module has not been set up on this harness. It's incomplete. But you can see the wires that are remaining here in this harness are your brown with the yellow stripe, which is your 12 volts for your ASD from your ASD relays powering your coils and your injectors. You have your green, which actually comes over here and is your starter solenoid wire. And then you have your other auxiliary functions that you'll need to run the sensors on here. So these really go down to the sensors just as needed. So think of this as going into the fuse box, and everything else, the business end on the ECM is done here. It's not a hard modification. You can see actually 12 volt direct PCM. This is the power to the PCM. Not a hard modification, but it is more detailed and more intricate than just a standard like a 05 Hemi truck harness. For simplicity's standpoint, in the 03 through the 08 engines, car or truck, the 05 truck is going to be the most simplistic wiring harness that you can modify for your application, and it also does not have SCIM, which is the security key interface module. 05 harness, in my opinion, is the way to go for simplicity. This is aesthetically more pleasing. It's up to you. It's whatever you want to do. That being said, let's kind of move along and compare the newer harness from the 2009 and on to see how it really stacks up to this guy. So we'll move this off. So here we have a harness from a 2014 Police Pursuit Charger, the 5.7 Hemi. First thing you'll kind of notice right off the bat is there are some similarities. One similarity being the cars really enjoy using the harness bracket that goes along the rear of the engine at the bell housing. So it secures the harness to the back of the engine at the bell housing, really enabling the factory to drop the body down on top of the engine and during the manufacturing process. Keeps things nice, tighter, cleaner, again, more aesthetically pleasing. Just as we did before, you have your coil and injector clips going on both sides of the engine, here and here. You have a central computer connector, or ECM connector, and a central connector that's kind of like the C130 that we refer to. Just for ease of communication, I'm going to keep calling it the C130. I know it varies by year and application, but it's going to help avoid some confusion in the tutorial. Here we have the ECM connector. Notice the lever lock style has changed. They've gone away from the NGC3 connector, which is really more of a German design, and going to something a little bit more compact. You have 2 connectors on the ECM now instead of 4. So this is really it in a nutshell. Also, you'll notice the wire loom on the harness itself is a braided mesh, which is a lot more durable than the older corrugated plastic wire loom. It's nicer stuff, better equipped. Here is the replacement, as you call it, C130 connector. So this is kind of the heart of your swap right here, these 2 connectors. You will need to acquire the other ECM connector from your donor car for the top side or the opposing side of the ECM to move forward along with the swap. There's really not much more to that. You know, there's the MDS harness, which plugs in here and goes underneath the intake manifold to activate and deactivate the cylinders, but that's not really important at this point in time. Alright, now that we've covered the basic layout of the Hemi Swap harness, remember in the previous video we did the trucks, and here earlier in this video we did the cars, the 05 through 8s, as well as the 09 and up car applications. That's, you know, your donor vehicle. Now we're going to kind of segue into the wiring harness details even more in depth so we can understand what's going on. The first thing we need to notice is the relay structure for your own standalone module. So if you're not using a factory power distribution module or fuse box, you're using your own fuse system and relay structure, this is what you need to know. This is what you need to take away. Traditionally, in a standalone harness, you have manufacturers out there. They do a great job. They have nice harnesses. I have the utmost respect for them. They are a bit pricey, so if you're a do-it-yourselfer and it's just something you want to do for a sense of pride or to be cost-effective, this is going to be the way to go. I'll give you some tips and tricks of what you need to know and what's optional. So, the 4 relays typically seen in the standalone harness. First, the starter relay, then the ASD or auto shutdown relay, then the fuel pump relay, and then a transmission relay. So, if you are running a manual transmission car, such as the old school A833 4-speed or 727 automatic and A904 automatic, you really don't need this relay because you have a non-electronic transmission. So let's go ahead and cast that out for now. Not necessary. Fuel pump is obvious. You need fuel pressure getting to the engine so that when the injectors actually pulse, fuel is getting injected into the engine. So the fuel pump relay actually is a little bit different than most people would actually realize. The ECM sends a ground to the fuel pump relay in order to activate the fuel pump to come on. It does not send 12 volts positive to the fuel pump relay. That's a common misconception and may throw you for a loop when you're creating your own wiring harness. Because the Hemi was heavily involved with Daimler at the time, Daimler Chrysler doing its development, you see a lot of German engineering traits in the design. One of that being supplied grounding instead of supplied 12 volts positive. It's just the way it is. Very common in Porsches, BMWs, and those European vehicles. So we have fuel taken care of. The ECM sends ground to the fuel pump relay. What we can also do is, let's go ahead and branch these off and say this is 12 volt positive, going to each of the 30 poles here. So our fuel pump's running. Now we need injection, we need ignition. That's going to come from the ASD relay. The ASD relay really is the heart of your engine's controls. You must have the ASD relay. That's because it supplies 12 volts constant power when the key is in the on position to your coils and your relay, your ignition coils and your fuel injectors. So your fuel injectors and your coils always have 12 volts power to them while the engine is running. The ECM simply grounds out each individual injector or coil as it's needed. So again, ECM sends a ground to activate the ASD relay, and your output of your ASD relay will come down here to a coil. Let's just say a coil, or even it'll branch off, it's the same circuit, to a fuel injector. Pardon my handwriting. And then from here, you have your grounds that go back to the ECM. So again, the ECM grounds out the ASD relay, which supplies 12 volts constant power to the coil and the fuel injector at all times while it's running. And then it triggers a ground to these components as they're needed on command based on the tune of the engine and the demand set forth in the calibration. So very important. Have to have, optional. Now let's talk about the starter. An ECM really only looks for the rotation of the crankshaft to know that, hey, it's time for me to run. You can integrate a starting relay into your standalone wiring harness if you would like to. Many people do them, but it's not totally necessary, and I'll tell you why. All you have to do is take your existing wire coming out of the bulkhead on your vehicle that you're swapping. So let's say an old school Mopar. You take your starter wire out of there. It goes down to that old brass starter relay that's usually on the inner fender well, and then down to the throw out on the starter, right? The solenoid just goes ahead and it pops it out, gets the engine spinning over. That's fine. That's all that's necessary. It really doesn't affect the ECM at all. The ECM just needs to see the rotation of that crankshaft to understand, hey, it's time for us to rock and roll, and it takes off from there. So, optional. Theoretically, you could have a 2-relay harness and be completely fine. The choice is yours. Do you aesthetically want to get rid of that old bulky brass starter relay on your inner fender well, or do you want to save a few dollars and just go with old reliable? Hey, it's worked for 40, 50 years, why change it? It's up to you. All right. Now that we've covered the 4-relay system and the structure, the theory behind the standalone harness, let's dive a little bit more into the actual layout for the wiring harness. So here we have a very crude Hemi engine, and this is the engine harness that you'll typically see you get from a salvage order from a donut vehicle. Is the ECM with the harness coming over onto both sides of the engine. Then you have your main connector, such as if your C130, depending on your application. You may have another connector right here that'll be for a 12-volt power source, but we can cover that in more detail later. From your 130 connector, the only wires you're going to be concerned with are the ones that are for your ASD relay, your fuel pump relay, and your starter if you're choosing to go with the starter route, and transmission if you're going with the transmission route. So those wires come through. You also have your APPS, or accelerator pedal position sensor, your gas pedal wires. Those 4 to 5 wires will come based on model, usually to a connector, or you can cut them if you're doing like the in-cabin electronic gas pedal. That'll come out here in the harness, and then you'll have your data port, which has the helicoiled CAN bus wires, or simple serial data wire if it's like the 03, 04 trucks. That'll go here. Here's your fuse box with your relays we just previously discussed. You have a ground, 12-volt constant, 12-volt key on, and you will also have, let's see if I can find one marker here. There we go. You will also have your wires going out, say your fuel pump, it comes out from the relay. If you want to do like an E-fan, that'll come out. AC compressor, if you want to integrate that into your structure here. Whatever you want to add on this end, just make sure you're terminating it or pinning in the terminal at the C130 connector all the way through. It's pretty straightforward. That's really the basics to it. If you go on the website DIYHEMI.com, you will see full pinouts for these connectors to know what you need to use and what you don't need to use. One thing that may be confusing, you'll see reference to wires that are called 5-volt signal or 5-volt reference. The ECM uses a 5-volt reference for all of its sensors to determine a specific reading, usually in a fraction of ohms or something of that nature. It's how it gets the measurements from the engine to know how to operate. So let's take engine coolant temperature sensor for example. The signal wire is going down there. There's a signal wire that provides 5 volts as a reference voltage, and then a signal wire that comes back to the ECM. And based on the variance across those two wires, it gets a reading from that sensor. So if you see a 5-volt reference wire or 5-volt signal wire as it's labeled here at this connector, that's going to a sensor, specifically the accelerator pedal position sensor on this side of the harness. Anything else that is 5-volt reference signal on this side of the harness, you don't need. 5-volt reference on the engine is a must. That is how the sensors are read. So crank, cam position, engine coolant temperature, all of your throttle body sensors, you need that 5-volt reference. It just simply will not work or run correctly without it. That's the lay of the land. I hope this helps. Really taking our baby steps into building a Hemi harness. On our next episode, we're going to do a few things a little bit differently. I'm going to gauge the audience. We'll see if we want to switch back to a live video feed on Facebook or YouTube, or if this format fits the masses a little bit better. And what we're going to do is physically build a harness from scratch and go through pin by pin for a specific application. I really think it'll be helpful to you all. If you have any questions, comments, definitely follow us. Shoot me DMs, private messages, anything to get our attention. We're usually pretty good about answering your questions, and we look forward to hearing from you and about your Hemi swap. Have a good night.